So the first thing I want to mention is my name. I'm Matt Alschbach. I am a professor of history here. I'm in my 12th year at Owensboro Community and Technical College. I teach about 200 students every semester, U.S. history, Kentucky history, World War II history. I love what I do. Best job I've ever had, and I've had lots of jobs. But I really enjoy the interaction with students, and I thought this semester I would do something a little different, and I would ask my students to do some really extensive research on the accused and accusers during the Salem Witch trials and produce a museum quality exhibit. And they did a tremendous job. I'm really excited with the work that they did. When you're finished here, if you've not had an opportunity, please go right across the street to our library right there, and you will find the Salem Witch trials exhibit. It's a really they did a great job, not only in terms of their research, but in terms of how they delivered that information, making sure that it was succinct, that it told the story, that it was empathetic in terms of the people who were accused, and even profiling some of the accusers and why they did it. There's great imagery over there. Some of our art students reproduced some woodcut prints that would have been used in the 13 and 14 and 1500s in order to really as a type of propaganda to show illiterate people what witchcraft looked like, what they should be afraid of, this sort of thing. And it was very effective. So please take a look at that to get an opportunity. Really neat. And I'm very proud of the work that my students have done. And many of the students are here in the classroom right now, so I appreciate it. So the title of my presentation is Examining the Root Causes of the Witchmania in Salem in 1692. Most Americans are familiar with the Salem Witch trials, and it evokes a lot of different ideas, a lot of different imagery. There's a lot of mythology as it relates to the Salem Witch trials. Rodney, am I moving around too much?
No, you're good.
Okay, good. All right, so I make sure. So we're going to be talking really about the root causes of the Salem Witch trials, of those accusations. And if you're here to learn about witchcraft, you're going to be disappointed because the Salem Witch trials were about really everything other than witchcraft. So we're going to be looking at those underlying causes. Today, when we think about witchcraft, it's just harmless fun. I just went into TJ Maxx and took a bunch of photos of products that were right in the entryway. Lots of fun stuff, as you can see there. We don't take too much concern about it. We're not afraid of witches, but they don't alarm us in the way that they used to. As you can see, some really fun stuff. I have a couple of delightful neighbors here, and they know that on my front porch I have 3 full-size witches around the cauldron, and it's very spooky, and the kids just love it when they walk up. They're just transfixed by these witches. They don't even care about the candy. So it's kind of fun. We're not really alarmed by any of this, but going back throughout European history, particularly Western European history, and even British colonial history in North America. Come on in, please. Come on in. Sign in if you would right there. Going back throughout, even recent history, when I say recent, I'm talking about, after Europeans made contact with the Americans in the 1500s and 1600s. Many of those ideas about witches, about the fact that they were real, persisted, and we have probably the most visible example of that in the year 1692 in Salem, when 19 people were executed for witchcraft. Now keep in mind, in the entirety of the British colonies in North America, 34 people were executed for witchcraft, 34 people. So we have this spate of accusations that takes place in 1692 in this small Salem village community. And it's a really extraordinary example of people taking things to the extreme. So let's go ahead and get into some of the basics here. This is just a quick rundown of some of the what unfolded in early 1692. The witchcraft trial started in January of 1692 when 2 really young girls fell violently ill. They were afflicted, they were having convulsions, they were vomiting, they were trying to squeeze themselves under the furniture. Really, really odd behavior. And Betty Paris, who first showed signs of illness, she was just 9 years old. She was the daughter of Salem village minister Samuel Parrish. And Samuel Parrish's niece, 12-year-old Abigail Williams, they were the first 2 people to be afflicted. They were very, very ill. And Samuel Parrish, the minister, initially he just thought they were sick. He didn't attribute it to witchcraft or anything sinister, but he brought in what would have been modern physicians in 1692. Remember, medicine was in the Dark Ages. But he brought these men in, and after studying these girls and examining their symptoms, they concluded that they were witched, that there was some sorcery at play. And this just explodes from there. So the young girls, once they recovered, they confirmed those suspicions. They claimed that they were visited by specters and apparitions that afflicted them, and that these apparitions resembled other members of Salem Village community in Salem Town. So you'll hear me use terms like Salem Town and Salem Village. Salem Town is on the eastern seaboard. It was a thriving business community populated by a group of people known as Puritans. And then further to the interior, to the northwest, there was this Salem Village. Salem Village developed a little bit later. It was rural. People that lived in Salem Village were not as affluent as people that lived in Salem Town. There was some kind of petty jealousies between Salem Village and Salem Town. And so the accusations began in this interior, this rural area of Salem Village with these two young ladies. And as I said, they confirmed some of those suspicions, and over the subsequent months, dozens of accusers claimed that they were visited by specters and apparitions bearing the likeness of the accused. So let me just clarify this right off the top. The Puritans were a devoutly religious people who had come from England, escaping their own religious persecution. When they came and landed in Boston, Massachusetts Bay Colony, all of that, we call these people pilgrims sometimes. When they arrived, they believed that it was possible for an individual to sign a compact with the devil, and that by doing so, it allowed Satan to take the spiritual form of that person and then visit other members of the community. Spectral evidence in the Salem Witch Trials was one of the most damning forms of evidence. It was allowed in the witch trials. But here's the problem with spectral evidence, this claim that someone's apparition has visited you in the night and bewitched you. You can't disprove it. It's just their word versus your word. And so this ends up being a major problem in the Salem Witch Trials. Other accusers claim that dead people appeared to them and charged the accused witches with murdering them. So people that had passed away in previous months and years allegedly appeared as apparitions to the accusers, and then implicated other members of the community, basically saying that their deaths, that there was someone in the community responsible in uncovering that person, and of course this accusation takes place. Many neighbors came forward to testify that the accused men and women were responsible for illness and the death of livestock. It's a really common thing in the Salem Witch Trials. If you read the documents, it talks about how a person's cows ran into a pond and drowned, or their chickens wouldn't give eggs, or the cow was producing discolored and tasteless milk. All kinds of really, really strange things that were happening with regard to agriculture. And so when people looked for explanations, they often just implicated their neighbors, claiming that they were witches and that they were somehow responsible for this. Let's take a look at some of the numbers here. 178 women and men were accused during the Salem Witch Trials. As you can see there, the percentage of them that were women, about 80%. By the way, that mirrors the witchcraft accusations in the Old World in Western Europe. It is estimated that 30 to 40,000 people were killed in Western Europe because it was presumed that they were witches or wizards or heretics. And tens of thousands of people were accused. So that really mirrors the percentage. So you can see disproportionately there's women that are being accused. At least 144 people were formally charged by the court of Oyer and Terminer, and I'll explain what that court is. And you can see the percentages there, 38 males. So roughly just less than 70% of those accused were women in Salem. The accused were often in prison for months. That's one of the really tragic aspects of the Salem Witch Trials, is that many of the accused men and women languished in the Boston and Salem prisons for months in really, really harsh, really grim conditions, and ultimately some of them languished to the point of death. 14 women and 5 men were found guilty by the court of Oyer and Terminer. That means to hear and to determine. I'll explain what that court was. They were hanged. Their trial length was 15 to 20 minutes, so not a lot of time to defend yourself. Also important to note that the defendants were not allowed lawyers. That was not a thing in British law. So you were responsible for defending yourself in front of a group of religious and political officials, magistrates from degrees like Harvard. Scary, scary, intimidating people, senior members of the church and the community who had visited Salem Village in order to put these people on trial. It was really terrifying for the women again that were put on trial. One defendant refused to enter a plea. His name was Giles Corey. My students know who he was. He was about 70 years old, and he'd been a very litigious man. He'd filed lots of lawsuits, and he was really defiant until the bitter end. And because he refused to enter a plea, he was pressed to death. I'm going to go ahead and break tradition and ask one of my students, what does it mean to be pressed to death?
To have rocks.
Who said it? Clay, what does it mean to be pressed to death?
It's almost like being stoned, except they pile rocks on it.
Yeah, the idea is to crush a confession out of the person. Giles Corey was forced to lay down in a ditch, and they put a big board over him, and they began to pile very, very large stones on top of him in order to elicit a confession. And allegedly his last words before he died were, "More weight." So he was defiant until the bitter end. Really defiant until the end. At least 5 people died in the prisons, including 2 infants. It's really the most tragic part of the story, is that infants were in prison with their mothers who had been accused. And I see just a look of astonishment on a few people's faces. Yes, that is true. It's important not to make too many presumptions about the Puritans and whether they were moral people, whether they were Christian people. I'm going to explain all of it. It's really simple just to go, what was wrong with these people? How could they believe this? It's ridiculous. But you really have to understand why they believed what they believed. So let's look at the accusers. The most energetic accusers were a group of girls and young women from Salem Village and the adjacent village of Andover to the northwest. They range in age from 11 to 20. So they really are the focal point, the starting point of these allegations. And as the accusation kind of spiral out of control, lots and lots of adults jump in. Lots of adults get involved in this as well. They all provide testimony that ultimately condemns many of the accused. Many of these accused girls had lost their parents in Indian wars to the north just a few years prior. And several of them were house servants, meaning once they lost their parents, kindly Puritan families brought them into their households, adopted them in a way to try and provide some care for them. But these young women that had been brought into these Puritan households, they were not family. They were typically house servants, and they had a very low status and very limited social mobility. And some historians have argued that when these accusations start, it is deliberate on the part of these young women as they are trying to diminish higher-ranking women in the community. That is one theory that is posited by historians. Let's talk a little bit about the mythology of the Salem Witch Trials, and there are many, many myths associated with the Salem Witch Trials. So some popular but incomplete or incorrect explanations. First is that Puritans were ignorant or that they were superstitious. We have to remember this is 1692. This is long before human beings had an advanced understanding of modern science or meteorology or climate science or epidemiology. And so, when bad things happened in Puritan communities, they immediately just presumed that either God had cursed them or that the devil had infiltrated their community, and that they needed to identify who the devil was working through and help hold them accountable, right? They had to eliminate that threat. Puritan men, another theory is that Puritan men hated women and that they wanted to control them. That's a real simplification. Certainly there was a degree of misogyny or hatred of women during the Salem Witch Trials that was kind of embedded within British law and British culture. But most of the Puritans were trying to defend their wives and their sisters and their daughters. They were trying to protect them. So it's really simple to just say, well, misogyny is the root cause of the Salem Witch Trials. There's much more to it than that. The trials were a land grab to deprive landholding women of their inherited properties. And even I've been guilty of overemphasizing this in my classrooms. Many historians have made this argument that many of the women that were accused during the Salem Witch Trials were in their 40s. They were widowed. They were what they would call a spinster at the time, and they had inherited property when their husbands passed away, and they did not remarry. Under British law, if you were a woman and you inherited property, there was a presumption that you would mourn for an appropriate period of time, but in relatively short order, you would get remarried, and when you did, the property that you inherited would fall with the possession of your new husband. But what's happening in Salem is that some of these women are not getting remarried because they like having a degree of economic freedom, right? They like that. And so some historians have kind of put these things together and tried to argue that it was just a deliberate attempt to strip these women of land. It's really important to understand British law at this time. So British law did not allow the courts to confiscate land if someone was convicted of witchcraft. But they could confiscate furniture, livestock, and possessions in order to pay for court fees, and that happened a lot. There were also some pre-existing legal disputes in Salem that involved members of the court and oyer intermediary, these religious magistrates, as well as members of the accused and accuser. So there's some overlap in terms of these lawsuits, but it's too simple to just say that this was a land grab. There was more to it than that. Another one is that the accusers were suffering from something called ergotism or ergot poisoning. Some of you may be familiar with this theory. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye meal in very cold and dry conditions. And a couple of years before the witchcraft trials, there had been some cases of ergotism where people felt very, very ill. By the way, ergotism has the same chemical properties as LSD. It's a hallucinogenic. It's a trans-narcotic. And so there had been some kind of sporadic cases of ergotism or ergot poisoning. And so in the early 1970s, there were a few historians who began arguing that these girls were just tripping on moldy bread. Right? Think about that. Like early 70s, late 60s, hippies. And this was like a really simple way to explain what happened. Oh, these girls were hallucinating and they were seeing visions. It is certainly possible that Betty Paris and Abigail Williams consumed moldy bread or ergot-tainted bread, but it doesn't explain the dozens and dozens of witchcraft allegations that were leveled by adults and thoughtful adult members of the community. So they pretty much disproven this idea that ergot poisoning is to blame for the accusations in Salem. And then another prevailing myth is that the accused were really witches because 54 of those accused persons actually admitted to using witchcraft or to signing a pact with the devil. They even gave really elaborate descriptions of how they signed the devil's book and how they met in the dead of night at a witch's Sabbath and they danced around a fire and gave these really explicit descriptions of how they were witches. But you have to understand, people came to realize very, very early on during the accusations that if you maintained your innocence, if you refused to admit guilt, you were going to the gallows. They were going to execute you. But if you admitted to being a witch and you then implicated other members of the community, the attention was then sent on to someone else. So people that were more interested in self-preservation refused to admit doing something they knew they did not do. So you got to think about Puritans. They're very religious people. Many of them are very religious. They're not going to lie because that's also considered to be a very serious sin. But when it comes to being hanged by the neck until you're dead, many of them ultimately say, okay, we're gonna do this because we just want to go back to our families. We're terrified. So there were a number of reasons. Really important, one of the myths that I hear most often is that the witches at Salem were burned. There were no witch burnings, none, during the Salem witch trials, none in the British colonies of North America. Witch burnings were something that happened during the Spanish Inquisition in the 15 and 1600s in areas controlled by Spain. The Catholic Church was very involved in that, and even then, most people that were burned at the stake were first strangled, and then they were burned at the stake. Because most people acknowledge that being burned alive was a horrible, horrible way to die. And that's not to detract from someone being hanged by the neck, also a terrible, terrible way to expire, right? Why were early Europeans and settlers to the Americas, why were they so preoccupied by fears of witchcraft? So as I mentioned previously, it is estimated that between 30 and 40,000 people were executed because they were thought to be witches or wizards or heretics or infidels in the old world. They were, well, let me get to this next, so let me get to that there. So I want to point out in this image, that's supposed to be an image of Martin Luther. Martin Luther in 1517, he was a Catholic priest. He was very well regarded in Germany. But he was really alarmed by the excesses of the Catholic Church. And so in 1517, he nails this document to the door of this church, basically protesting what he saw were abuses of the Catholic Church. He was trying to reform the Catholic Church, but what he did is he created this terrible schism within the Catholic Church that led to the so-called Protestant Reformation, where people within the Catholic Church, they were basically sheared away and they formed their own Protestant denominations. That's literally what it means to be a Protestant or a non-Catholic, is like you're protesting the excesses of the Catholic Church. And so it creates this terrible schism. And the Catholic Church in Rome was really alarmed by this. They were very, very concerned by what they saw as Satan infiltrating the true and pure and Christian Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic Church became really obsessed with rooting out heresy and trying to target people that were outside of Orthodoxy, and they began to target Jews and Muslims and people that were doctors and midwives, this sort of thing. It's really interesting how it all unfolded, but catastrophic particularly for the lower classes, for people living in villages in Europe, for simple folk who were practicing what we today would just call homeopathic medicine, folk remedies. They were often seen as witches, and they were rounded up. There is an element of vilification of females in the Old World, really from about 400 on. During the Middle Ages, and just to clarify, the Middle Ages would be about 500 AD to about 1500 AD, so roughly 1,000 years, where it was presumed that women were vulnerable to demonic possession. Women were thought to be more likely to give in to their carnal desires. They were thought to be weak mentally and spiritually and physically. Church officials and witch hunters were particularly suspicious of young, beautiful women because they assumed that because they were alluring to men, that the devil would be likely to use them to seduce unsuspecting men, to sign the devil's book. So there is clearly an element of misogyny here. Women were more likely to do the devil's work. As I just alluded to a moment ago, women who served as doctors and healers and midwives were particularly frequent targets for allegations of witchcraft because they seem to have a spiritual connection, a really nuanced understanding, as I said, of herbs and roots and remedies and potions and tonics, that sort of thing. So they were often targeted as witches, midwives in particular. The concern, certainly after the Protestant Reformation, was that a midwife was really dangerous because if left if you didn't watch them, that they would take a newborn and they would carry it off into the night and sacrifice it to the devil. And again, don't judge these people yet. I know, I'm getting a lot of great looks from, particularly the ladies in the audience. I'm getting a lot of great looks. I love it. Okay, so I want to talk specifically about the role of indigenous and African people. So one thing that we see after Europeans began to colonize the New World, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the British, is that they begin to believe very early on that if you're looking for the origin point of witchcraft, you often have to look at people of Native American descent or African descent or mixed race descent. Because these men and women, usually women, but oftentimes men, shaman we would call these people, were carrying on the medical traditions of their ancestors. Women in many African and Native American societies served as healers and curers and legitimate doctors. So it was only natural that they would persist in those roles in colonial America. So on one hand, it's assumed that women are natural caregivers, that they're nurturers, that they take care of the sick, the elderly, children, and that they're most genetically qualified to do that. But then at the same time, if a woman was a curer or a healer using legitimate medical remedies to try and treat people, if that person she was treating did not recover, often there would be this allegation of witchcraft. So being a female curer or healer or doctor was a really dangerous profession, both in Europe during the Middle Ages and certainly in the New World after the 1500s when Europeans began to arrive here. This is a really important text that goes a long way in explaining the spate of witchcraft accusations in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. A couple of German Dominican monks or friars by the name of Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, they decided that they were going to write an authoritative treatise on witchcraft. It's called the Malleus Maleficarum, but a more proper translation from the Latin would be a hammer of female evildoers. So notice that it says a hammer of witches, not a hammer of wizards. So basically what these two priests did is they said, we need to have a comprehensive manual on how to identify what constitutes witchcraft, what a witch looks like, how do we deal with these people, how do we determine whether or not they are actually witches, and how do we mete out punishments. The authors of this document made the argument that not all women were witches, but witches were almost definitely going to be female. And so this is catastrophic in terms of what it does. This is a bestseller. It's translated into multiple languages. It spurs the publication of dozens and dozens of witch finder or witch hunting manuals in many European nations. One thing that was really problematic is just a few years after its publication, a new version was printed. And this is right about the time of movable type and, not quite a printing press, but the ability to mass produce written works. And one edition had a papal bull attached to it, making it seem as though it was authorized by the Pope. And we don't know if that's actually legitimate or not. But this created a kind of authoritative feeling for people that were reading this, that this is being handed out straight from the Vatican, straight from the Church. And so this certainly adds credence to this idea that witches are very, very real. How many of you know who Matthew Hawkins is? Anyone heard this guy's name before? Anyone know one? Wow, okay, I guess I'm the unfortunate person to bring this information to you. So, Matthew Hawkins was a self-proclaimed witch hunter. During the English Civil War in the 1640s, about 45 years or so before the Salem Witch trials. In the 1640s, England was at war with itself. There was a real breakdown of law and order, and Matthew Hopkins was in his mid-20s. He was a young man. He was not an ordained minister. He had no theological experience that we are aware of. But he began traveling around rural areas of eastern England and basically bringing together citizens and villages and hamlets and asking them if they had any witches. And basically telling them that if you do, we probably need to put these people on trial and hold them accountable. And soon there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that are being rounded up in village after village after village in England. And ultimately about 20 people are executed. It lasts about a year and a half before he is disproven. People begin to ask questions and challenge him. They're really just challenging whether or not he has any religious authority to do this. Again, he's not an ordained minister. He has no authority to do any of this. And he falls very ill, but just before he dies, he publishes that book that you see there, Discovery of Witches, another authoritative treatise on how to ferret out, prosecute, and execute witches, right? So this just adds to the mythology. And you better believe the Puritans in Salem were well aware of this document. They knew exactly what had happened in England. They believed that witches were very real. They used this as a guidebook, a blueprint to target witches. So why the Puritans and why Salem in 1692? Well, the first Puritans to settle in Massachusetts Bay in the 1620s and 1630s, they were fiercely devout people. They were escaping religious persecution in England and in the Netherlands. They came to the New World. They founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony at Boston. But they were fiercely, as I said, religious and dogmatic people, really intolerant of other Christian denominations. People like Quakers and Baptists and Anabaptists. And Quakers looked a lot like Puritans and believed a lot like Puritans, but to Puritans, these people were outsiders and infidels. They were very different from Puritans. Puritans believed that everything that happened, good or bad, was evidence of God's either approval or dissatisfaction. Puritans also believed that the line separating the temporal and physical world from the spiritual, supernatural realm was very thin. They believed that the physical and spiritual worlds collided each night. So they believed that women left unsupervised might steal away into the dead of night, the witch's hour, midnight, and that they would convene a witch's Sabbath, a circle where women would frolic and dance in the moonlight while, the sound of a distant drum pierced the wind and the rain. Really powerful imagery, right? It's provocative. And again, we all listen and say, this is just absurd. I just want to point out to you that in 2024, human beings believe all kinds of nonsense that is not true. Human beings still believe many, many things that are not true. There is an enormous amount of disinformation in 2024. And think about it, we have access to more information than at any time in human history, and in some ways humans are more deluded than they have ever been. Because people often seek out sources of information that just affirm what they think they already know, rather than challenging your belief system. There's an important lesson here, right? If you think that something is so, research it, right? Question, challenge what you believe and why you believe it.
And
These are all images that were produced in the Middle Ages and early modern period. And again, it's really powerful. There's some really interesting things happening here. This is a really famous artist known as Goya. He was Spanish. He produced a lot of images on what a witch's Sabbath might look like. We got other images here. Look at this one. I always like to point this one out to my students. There's all kinds of things happening in this image right here. So you have this guy who looks like a legitimate priest. So the idea is that maybe he delivered mass earlier in the day, but now he's stole away into the dead of night and he is conducting this otherworldly ritual. You've got a cauldron with the bodies of the dead being used as fuel for it. You have women in the nude. You've got a suggestion of bestiality here. You've got this demon clutching this woman by the shoulders and holding out what appears to be an image of the Virgin Mary. You got some hot squirrel on squirrel action right here. It's just chaos. Just total pandemonium. But there were a lot of stereotypes about the Puritans. The stereotype is that Puritans were this joyless, rigid, very stern people who wore drab colors and spent their entire lives engaged in prayer and work. And some Puritans were really devout. Probably the most recognizable example of this was a woman by the name of Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca Nurse was a senior member of Salem Village community. She was also called a visible saint, meaning that the Puritan church in Salem respected this woman so much that they had given her this designation of a visible saint, meaning that she was destined for heaven. The reason why this is important, the Puritans believed that you had no power over whether or not you went to heaven. God made this choice for you before you were born. It's called predestination. So Puritans did not believe that there was anything you could do in this physical life to get you to heaven, but they also believed that if you were in fact predestined, that there would be this visible manifestation of piety and holiness throughout your life. And that was Rebecca Nurse. She was a beloved member of the community, but she was accused of witchcraft and ultimately she was hanged. And this is a major turning point in the Salem witch trials. People began to really question the actions of Poor Terminator because she was so beloved. It just made no sense that this woman was hanged. Other Puritans were much less religious. They gossiped, they distrusted their neighbors, they engaged in petty squabbles, they filed lawsuits against their neighbors and family members over inheritance, over property rights, that sort of thing. Many Puritans rarely attended church. They disliked their ministers. They were just like us, right? We got lots of Sunday Christians or Christians that go on Easter and on Christmas, right? That sort of thing, right? A couple times a year you make your appearance, put a little money in the bowl, that sort of thing. Very, very similar to what we do today. But one of the things that I want to talk about here that I think the reason why I mentioned Native Americans is this has been ignored throughout history until just the last 20 years. There are some great female historians who in the last 20 years have uncovered a lot of information about the Salem witch trials. And the reason why I mention that is that if you think about all of the interrogations, all of the court documents, they were all produced by men. All of them. Every manuscript, every document, every piece of research, every historiography, everything that was written about the Salem witch trials for hundreds of years was produced by men. It was really not until the last 30 years or so that women stepped in as historians. By the way, there are very few women in history, but it is a growing field where more and more women are stepping in and telling that story. So there's about a half a dozen books written by really tremendous female historians, and they're trying to consider things that male historians had not considered. And what do you know? They're telling a very different story. And one of them in particular, a woman by the name of Mary Beth Norton, she decided she was going to look at a set of Indian conflicts that took place to the north of Salem in the decades prior to the Salem witch trials. And it was incredible what she uncovered. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that now. So the three primary tribes, the three primary tribes in New England were the Wabanaki, sometimes known as the Abenaki, the Namkig, and the Wampanoag. These tribes were indigenous to New England. And as Puritan settlers arrived in ships in the 1620s and 1630s, and they began to push inland. They began to push into the interior. They began to push northward into what's the state of Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and even into Maine. And as they did, they began to trespass on Native Americans' land. Now, Puritans traveled to major waterways in Maine in order to cut down timber. There was lots of forest in Maine, still is. But what they were looking for were really, really sturdy logs that they could use to provide masts and spars for the British Navy at that time. So they began to trespass on Native Americans' lands. It didn't help that Puritans thought Native Americans were in the grip of Satan, that they were heathen savages and they worshipped false gods. And so it wasn't long before the Puritans attacked Native Americans and vice versa. If you look at Puritan documents, they're always the victim. Puritans are always defending themselves against Indian attacks. That is not the truth. The Puritans could be incredibly brutal in the way they treated Native Americans, in particular the 1637 Pequot War, when Puritans just began eradicating entire tribes and just driving Native Americans out, burning their villages, killing men, women, and children. It was really quite gruesome. And so it's not surprising that Native Americans reacted in kind. So we're going to talk about a couple of Native American wars. The first is King Philip's War, the so-called First Indian War. You'll note there it lasted about 3 years. And it was incredibly brutal. Native Americans massacred communities. They drove Puritan communities back to eastern seaboard areas. They burned entire communities and villages. It was impossible to inhabit some of these areas for years because there was such incredible hostility. And what it did is it created this kind of pervasive state of fear for the Puritans that it was only a matter of time before they were going to be attacked by indigenous Americans once again. And as you see on screen there, the Second Indian War, King William's War as it is known, it lasts even longer. In this war, the British and their colonists were fighting against French colonists from the St. Lawrence River in Canada and their Native American allies. Many residents of Salem actually fought in or were victims of this particular Indian War. They were displaced by them. There is no question that many of the people that survived King William's War suffered from what we would today identify as PTSD, real stress, real trauma associated with this. As I mentioned, many of the young women that were the accusers were orphans. They had lost their families in really violent episodes. And decades of warfare and bloodshed really convinced Puritans that God was displeased with the Puritan community and the Puritan church. Now, I always save this one for last because, quite frankly, it is boring. I don't even cover this in class because I just see my students' eyes glaze over the minute I start talking about politics. But it is actually very important. The Massachusetts Charter was given to the Puritans when they landed in New England in the 1620s, and the reason that was remarkable is to this point, the British Empire and the King, Charles I at this point, they had like an iron grip on British colonies around the world, but because New England was so far away from England, they gave the Puritans a remarkable degree of autonomy and freedom to do what they wanted. There wasn't any real strict control on what the Puritans didn't even fly the British flag, right? They considered themselves almost to be an independent entity. And so ultimately, the Parliament, the British Congress, the equivalent of our Congress, revoked the Massachusetts Bay Charter in 1684 and replaced it with a different one in 1691 that was far more restrictive. Basically what the 1691 charter did is it combined Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth Colony, and Maine Colony into the Dominion of New England and placed it under the leadership of a colonial governor, a man by the name of William Phipps. And it reduced the power of local authorities and local magistrates. William Phipps had only been the governor of New England for a few months when he arrived here after getting the charter signed, only to find out that there'd been this spate of accusations, and he was much more concerned with what was happening in the north with these Indian wars. And so he basically asked members of the Salem village community to act as the court ouvrier and terminator. So these are not necessarily legal officials. They're not necessarily learned men. Some of them are, some of them are not. They brought in some outside officials from Boston that did have degrees from institutions of higher learning. But you have to imagine many members of the court of are just neighbors. Neighbors that you might have had pre-existing disputes with. Maybe you didn't like them, maybe they didn't like you. So there was a lot of opportunity for corruption, right, and abuse. So with the Massachusetts Bay Charter that's revoked and then replaced, this would be the equivalent of our Congress revoking the Bill of Rights that protects states' rights and individual rights, right? We would see this with great alarm. We would be most concerned about this. So the Puritans are really alarmed by a great many things that are happening in their community that I think will fully explain the accusations and the spate of witch trials that we see. Just in wrapping this up, I don't want to go too long here. What lessons did the Puritan religious and political leadership from the Salem Witch trials, and keeping in mind that there's no separation of church and state in Massachusetts, the religious officials are the political officials. Well, they take a couple of really important lessons from this. One is that women have been subverting the male-dominant order in Puritan society. They're basically taking the established male-controlled order and flipping it on its head. They didn't like that. So the witch trials were a way of kind of flipping things right? Kind of turning, like holding these women accountable, trying to end these accusations and reestablish control and reestablish those male-dominant norms. Witches were really an explanation for the chaos and the disorder of the 17th century. Bad things happen to people all the time. Women died in childbirth, children died in childbirth, livestock died, crops died from blight, all kinds of terrible things happened. So the reasonable pivot was, who's responsible? Oh wait, Denise across the way, isn't she a healer or a curer? Didn't she treat my wife at one point just before she passed away? Well, maybe she's responsible for it, right? The other kind of big lesson they take from this is that young women should not be trusted. Again, because young women were really at the root of this. It's this idea that young women should be seen and not heard, and it had really been that way prior. One of the reasons why these young women take off with these accusations is because they are being paid attention to for the first time. Young women are invisible in Puritan New England, and suddenly really important men are paying attention to them. They like the attention. They're being brought before all of these important religious officials and authorities. But then they start to execute people. And these girls had a really difficult decision to make. Do we recant and get into a lot of trouble for the lives of innocent people being lost, or do we run with it? Do we sell it? How many of you believe that these young women were making it up based on the evidence that I've provided? Show of hands if you think they made the whole thing up. Maybe a little less than half. A little less than half. A lot of people believe that. I'm sure that some of those young women were fabricating the entire story. But it is also possible that those girls did see visions, that they did believe they were being visited by apparitions, that they had dreams that were very vivid to them, right? Especially as this thing takes off. They believe that witchcraft is real. They believe that it is possible for God to bless you and provide all of the things that you need, but it's also possible for Satan to curse you and diminish you, right? So it's too simple to just say, they were all frauds. One thing I always like to point out with the Salem witch trials is that we do see years later a kind of begrudging and gradual acknowledgement that the witch trials were a terrible injustice. The Massachusetts colony actually restored the names of the condemned in 1711 and provided restitution to surviving family members. I mean, that's pretty remarkable when a government does that. It says, wow, we really messed this up. We really screwed this up. And I want to leave you with a primary source or an eyewitness account. So one of the most notorious accusers in the Salem witch trials was a woman by the name of, woman is incorrect. She was a girl, Ann Putnam Jr. She was from a very prestigious family in Salem Village. She was responsible for accusing nearly 60 people of witchcraft in Salem Village. Almost every person that was executed was accused by Ann Putnam Jr. as well as others. Years later, she is trying to become a full member of the church in Salem, and the church required that she write a confession and that she read it publicly. So let's take a look at it. She says, I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family in the year about 1692. That I, then being in my childhood, should by such a providence of God be made an instrument for the accusing of several persons of a grievous crime whereby many lives were taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe that they were innocent persons, and that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time, whereby I just fear that I have been instrumental with others, though ignorantly and unwittingly, to bring upon myself and this land the guilt of innocent blood. Though what was said or done by me against any person, I can truly and uprightly say before God and man, I did not do it out of anger, malice, or ill will to any person. Does that sound like accountability to you? Yeah. It was out of my control. I was a child. I didn't know what I was doing. I was caught up in this hysteria. She was a kid. Yeah.
But I'm sure the child.
Yeah, she was young. She was young. I believe she was 14. And are there any questions? Any questions or comments? Again, I don't want to take it too far. Those are some of the great sources that I use, all female historians. Yes, Rodney, please.
Of all the people that were tried, what about the people who were innocent? What did their life, like how did that affect their life? You were accused of being a witch, you're not a witch.
There's this spate of accusations that takes place over several months. It really builds to a crescendo in the summer of 1692. And then, they kind of put a pause on things. The governor puts a pause on things. Kind of, let's hold off. Let's reconsider whether we should use spectral evidence. Should that be? Because there were some really important religious officials that were saying, we can't use spectral evidence, right? No one can disprove spectral evidence, this apparition. So they basically put a pause on it, and then it fizzles out on its own. And so as they kind of start to count the cost, so many people have been involved. I mean, think about the role of religious leadership in letting this go too far, right? The people that should have known better, the people that were learned, the people that understood doctrine and religious issues and had read all those witch hunters manuals, they should have known that some of the accusations were questionable or just outright false, right? So I think there's a lot of, kind of collecting what had happened and trying to make some sense of it, and people that were just, so distraught over the loss of loved ones and family members. A great crime had occurred. And it was made possible by a group of religious men, in particular, a Supreme Court justice by the name of William Stoughton. He had been brought in from the outside. He was a, really well-respected leader. They called him Your Honor and Your Excellency. He, whatever he said went. He was the one who basically said, we're going to listen to spectral evidence. And that was it. That was it. Other questions? Yes?
Well, I don't have a question. I just want to ask you what you have.
Please.
The witchcraft, the killing of witchcraft still exists out in Nigeria.
Yes.
And they still practice faith.
Yes.
They kill people, accusing them of witchcraft.
I'm so glad you mentioned it.
They are still stoning people to death of these laws.
That's correct. That's correct, yeah. Again, it seems lighthearted.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, she said that witchcraft still exists. She's from Nigeria, and they still stone people to death for witchcraft in some African nations. In Papua New Guinea, there's a custom in Papua New Guinea where if something terrible happens in the community, they will literally just identify an individual in their community that is not well liked, and they'll hunt them. They will hunt them and kill them, and that's how they kind of exonerate the greater community. They purge the evil from the community, and hopefully bad things don't happen after that. Right? So as much as we see it as a kind of a harmless pastime around Halloween, it is very serious in some areas of the world. So thank you so much for adding that. Do you have anything else?
Well, I just want to say
thank you.
that some people truly confessed to witchcraft.
Oh, yeah.
For example, in one of our church, they were having a vigil, and birds were flying on top of the roof. The birds fell inside of the church and turned to human. This is not a story, this is real.
Yeah. People
And they
believe it.
confessed that they were going for their witchcraft meeting, but the prayer of the church brought them down and they confessed, and the pastor asked if they want to give their life to Christ. They said, they would rather die serving Satan than giving their life to Christ.
Yeah.
They were not killed. They actually stopped.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned it. And I didn't mention this in my talk, but when the two little girls became very, very ill, the first person that they implicated was Samuel Paris's house slave, a woman by the name of Chichuba, who they basically just said it's got to be her. Samuel Paris, he beat her to try and elicit a confession. Surprisingly, she confessed, right? And then she implicated other members of the community to get the attention away from her. And she becomes a major witness in the Salem Witch trial. She and her husband, John Indian, right? That's who she was married to. They were both from Barbados. He is another major player in the Salem Witch trials as accusers because they understand that they are likely targets as minorities, and so they're doing everything they can to stay on the offensive so that the magnifying glass is not on them. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yes?
You mentioned 19 people were executed in Salem.
Yeah.
And a little more than a dozen elsewhere. So were there any locations specific, were they spread out? Was it before 1692, after 1692?
Almost all of them were prior to 1692. That's really the last major episode that we see. Most of it took place in New England communities, some of the other surrounding regions. There were a number of witch trials that took place on islands like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, other European colonies, that sort of thing. Obviously, if we're talking about Spain and the New World, they controlled Mexico's Central America, most of South America. Because that's the hub of the Inquisition, they had their own set of witch trials that took place. Actually, in my graduate degree, I looked at what happened in Spain and how indigenous people and people of African descent were disproportionately targeted because it was thought that they were the origin point, the focal point. Does it? Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Yeah. Other questions or comments?
I have one.
Yes.
Matt,
Yes. Dan.
when you said that the religious leaders should have known better about what they were doing and how far they let things go away, weren't the religious leaders in 1692, in the 17th century, weren't they religious zealots to the point of coming from England, coming from all that persecution? Don't you think they instigated a lot of this stuff?
It's a great question. Many of them are very serious and very devout in their faith. That is true. Some are more skeptic than others. Really important to realize about the religious leadership is the Puritan community was created as this kind of religious utopia. I mean, they called themselves Puritans. They said they were going to purify. They were going to be the true church. They were going to be a city on a hill, this beacon to everyone around the world that this is what true Christianity looks like. But within about a generation, a lot of Puritans are much less devout. They're more interested in business and making money. And I feel like a lot of the religious leaders in Salem in 1692 felt like their utopia was dying, right? And so this is a way for them to reestablish control over the Puritan community, right? To kind of say, we're still in control. We have not abandoned this idea that we can be set apart and sanctified. Yeah, great question. Great question. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
So you touched briefly on the tendency to target healers, women who are healers. I'm just curious to know your thoughts on if you think, that target on healers and kind of played a role in decentering women from, the healthcare sphere in general,
that's good.
how that affects.
That's good. Well, so you have to keep in mind in rural communities in Europe, there were always local healers and doctors. And if your child was sick, if you had some sort of skin aberration, whatever it might be, you go to your local healer, and they were seen as very, very legitimate, right? They would help you with whatever ailed you. They'd do their best. But you have these kind of moments of mania where things kind of spiral out of control, and suddenly those people are in great danger. Particularly, as I said, if someone under their care didn't survive, and there's a bitter family member at home, a husband, a wife, a widow, a widower, right? And they want to hold that person accountable. But there's a reason why women were seen as healers and that sort of thing. If you just think back, going back thousands of years, men were the hunters. They would go out and they would slay the buffalo and the antelope and all of that. And the women would stay home and they would tend the gardens and they would, hybridize plant seeds, and they were really responsible for plant domestication. And so they learn, if you've got an upset stomach, you can take this and it'll help you. Like aloe vera. Aloe vera is a Native American remedy for burns and ant bites. It basically helps with skin irritation, that sort of thing. So a lot of these were very legitimate, but a lot of male and female healers and cures would combine like a legitimate medical remedy with a more supernatural aspect. It might be a spell, an incantation. It might blow peyote smoke on the person, something like that. And so, of course, when the Catholics get here in the 1500s and they see these healers here, they're like, that's got to stop. That's witchcraft. Right? They don't realize that they're actually driving underground legitimate medical practices. So, great question.